There are horror films that scare you. There are thrillers that make you think. And then there's The Silence of the Lambs, a film that haunts you in ways you didn't know were possible. Watching it, you're drawn into a game where the stakes are as high as they get. Life or death. But what really sets this film apart? It's not just the story or even the infamous Hannibal Lecter. It's the way every choice made, from casting to lighting to sound, crafts a psychological labyrinth that leaves the audience both fascinated and disturbed, even 30 years later. Before we dive into the meat of it, let's set the scene. The Silence of the Lambs is not your typical thriller. Released in 1991, it took home all 5 major Academy Awards: Best Picture, Director, Actor, Actress, and Adapted Screenplay. That's a rare feat for any film, let alone one that deals with such dark subject matter. But why? How did this film about a young FBI trainee and a cannibal psychiatrist captivate both audiences and critics alike? At its core, The Silence of the Lambs is a story about 2 characters: Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster, and Dr. Hannibal Lecter, portrayed by Anthony Hopkins. From the start, the film sets them up as opposites. Starling is young, inexperienced, and eager to prove herself. Lecter is older, intellectually sharp, and chillingly dangerous. And yet, in a strange, almost poetic way, they form a bond. Starling is sent to interview Lecter as part of her investigation into another serial killer, Buffalo Bill, and he immediately sees something in her, a purity, a vulnerability, that he decides to toy with. But this isn't just about mutual curiosity, it's about power. Lecter has all of it, and he knows it. What makes their relationship so electric is that Starling isn't scared in the way you'd expect. She's determined, driven, and willing to go toe-to-toe with him. And it's this unyielding determination that fascinates Lecter, who is used to others recoiling in horror or cowering before his intelligence. Let's talk about the casting, because it's rare to find 2 actors who inhabit their roles so completely. Jodie Foster's portrayal of Starling is grounded and intense. She's not the archetypal tough girl we often see in crime dramas. She's vulnerable, but her vulnerability doesn't undermine her strength, it enhances it. Foster's subtle choices, from the way she carries herself to the haunted look in her eyes, convey a deep-seated trauma and resilience that resonate on screen. You sense that Starling is constantly fighting battles, both external and internal, and that's what makes her so compelling. And then there's Anthony Hopkins. With only around 16 minutes of screen time, he does the impossible. He creates a character so memorable that he becomes synonymous with cinematic terror. The thing is, Hopkins doesn't play Lecter like a monster. He plays him like a human, albeit a profoundly twisted one. His voice is calm, even soothing at times, and his gaze is direct, almost piercing. Lecter doesn't need to shout or use violence to assert his dominance. His calm, measured demeanor is more unsettling than any display of rage could be. The Silence of the Lambs uses its visual style to mirror the themes of the story. Take, for example, the iconic close-ups. Director Jonathan Demme uses them liberally, especially in scenes with Lecter, where the camera almost traps us in his gaze. The result? The audience becomes as exposed and vulnerable as Starling herself. This choice heightens the tension and creates a sense of intimacy that's as disturbing as it is compelling. Then there's the symbolism. The film plays heavily with ideas of sight and perception. Hannibal Lecter is always watching Starling, the guards, and even us, the audience. He's like a predator, calmly observing his prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. And on the other side, Starling is constantly looking into the darkness, into her past, into the minds of killers. There's a recurring theme of seeing versus being seen, predator versus prey. And it's all framed within a world where trust is rare and motives are hidden behind masks. One of the things that makes The Silence of the Lambs so disturbing is that the horror isn't purely external. Sure, there are graphic scenes and horrific ideas, but the film's true terror lies in its exploration of the human psyche. Lecter's conversations with Starling aren't just about the case. They're about her fears, her insecurities, and her past trauma. He probes her in ways that are intensely uncomfortable because they touch on universal fears. Fears of failure, inadequacy, and vulnerability. And let's not forget Buffalo Bill, the main antagonist in the film. He's not just a serial killer. He's a construct of society's darkest sides. He represents the twisted desire for control and transformation, taken to a horrifying extreme. The film doesn't shy away from showing his cruelty, but it also doesn't paint him as just a bad guy. Instead, Buffalo Bill becomes a terrifying reflection of what happens when humanity's most disturbing impulses are left unchecked. Jonathan Demme's direction and Ted Tally's screenplay create a palpable sense of dread that intensifies with each scene. Fear in the Silence of the Lambs isn't derived from cheap thrills or jump scares. Instead, it's psychological, embedded in the anticipation and in what isn't shown. It's a fear that sneaks up on you, lingers, and leaves you on edge. The pacing is deliberate, almost methodical, much like Hannibal Lecter himself, and it allows the audience to sit with the horror, to experience it on a visceral level. One example is the basement scene near the end, where Starling enters Buffalo Bill's lair. Demme uses night vision shots to put us in Bill's perspective, making the audience feel like both the hunter and the hunted. It's a brilliant way to pull us into Starling's terror as she gropes through the darkness, knowing the killer is watching her every move. This method, using perspective to play with the viewer's emotions, amplifies the tension to almost unbearable levels, creating a cinematic experience that's hard to forget. In scenes with Lecter, Demme often chooses silence over music. It's as if the absence of sound allows Lecter's words to echo louder, making his observations about humanity hit even harder. When Lecter famously asks, "Have the lambs stopped screaming?" it's not just a line, it's an echo of Starling's trauma, haunting her and the audience alike. The absence of background noise during these exchanges forces us to confront the intensity of Lecter's presence, making him unforgettable. One of the film's most fascinating aspects is the way it explores identity and transformation. Each character in The Silence of the Lambs is, in some way, searching for a new self or fighting to escape from their current one. Clarice Starling is a young woman from a troubled past, trying to establish herself in a male-dominated world. She faces not only external challenges from her superiors and her gruesome assignments, but also internal battles, ghosts of her childhood trauma, and a constant drive to prove herself. On the opposite end, we have Buffalo Bill, who embodies a warped version of this transformation. He's obsessed with becoming someone else to the point of violence. His identity crisis is exaggerated, twisted, and perverse, showing a nightmarish reflection of what happens when self-identity is warped beyond recognition. His actions are monstrous, but his desperation is human, and the film subtly acknowledges that fact. The dynamic between Starling's earnest self-discovery and Buffalo Bill's horrifying transformation adds a layer of complexity to the narrative, making the audience both fascinated and horrified. One of the reasons The Silence of the Lambs is so captivating is the psychological chess game between Starling and Lecter. As she questions him for clues about Buffalo Bill, Lecter often turns the interrogation back on her, probing into her mind and past. The power dynamic is in constant flux. Starling's vulnerability, being a young woman in the FBI, could be seen as a weakness, but it actually becomes her strength. Her willingness to show honesty, something Lecter rarely encounters, is what earns her his respect. And yet, there's always the underlying threat. Lecter is restrained in his cell, but his mind is free, sharp, and always calculating. You feel that at any moment, he could shatter the calm, but the politeness of his words is merely a veil. This tension between them, this dance of trust, manipulation, and fear, is what drives the film's energy. We're never entirely sure where Lecter's loyalty lies, and that uncertainty keeps the audience, like Starling, on edge. The Silence of the Lambs has left a mark not only on the horror and thriller genres, but on film as a whole. It broke boundaries, both in terms of narrative and in its portrayal of complex female characters in a genre dominated by male leads. Clarice Starling isn't just a final girl or a damsel in distress. She's a fully realized character with agency, determination, and depth. The film doesn't just use her trauma as a plot device. It's woven into her character, shaping her motivations and her decisions. The character of Hannibal Lecter has since become an archetype of sorts, inspiring countless other intelligent villains in film and television. But what makes Lecter unique is his multifaceted nature. He's charming, sophisticated, and even likable at times, but he's also terrifying. This blend of charisma and danger makes him unforgettable and elevates him beyond the typical serial killer trope. Many have tried to replicate Lecter's appeal, but few have come close to the chilling perfection of Anthony Hopkins' performance. 3 decades after its release, The Silence of the Lambs remains a cultural touchstone. It's not just a film, it's a study in fear, power, and the darkness within. It taps into universal fears of loss of control, of vulnerability, of being hunted, and presents them in a way that's both thought-provoking and profoundly unsettling. The film also opened doors for complex portrayals of villainy and heroism in cinema, proving that a film could be dark, violent, and deeply psychological while still resonating with mainstream audiences. In the years since its release, The Silence of the Lambs has become more than just a thriller. It's a film that demands analysis, that invites viewers to look deeper into its layers. Each viewing offers new insights, new details that add to the richness of its storytelling. The film isn't just about the chase for a killer or a young woman's journey into the darkness. It's about the monsters within us all, the lambs we try to silence, and the power of facing our fears head-on. As the end credits roll, you can't help but feel changed, as though you've been through a journey that's more than just cinematic. The Silence of the Lambs is that rare film that doesn't just show us a story. It forces us to confront parts of ourselves we'd rather avoid. It reminds us that sometimes, to understand the darkness, we must face it directly. And for Clarice Starling, for Hannibal Lecter, and for audiences everywhere, that journey into the unknown is as thrilling as it is terrifying. As always, Movies Minded, thank you for joining us on this exploration of one of cinema's most haunting masterpieces. Remember, fear is only as powerful as the hold we let it have on us. Until next time, keep watching, keep questioning, and don't be afraid to look into the shadows.